You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us virtually at the U.S. Institute of Peace. My name is Lyndi Tsering, and I'm a program specialist on the China team here at USIP. For those of you just getting to know us, the U.S. Congress established USIP in 1984 as a national, nonpartisan public institution dedicated to helping prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. We're gathered here today to launch USIP's newly published report, Huawei's Expansion in Latin America and the Caribbean, Views from the Region. Based in Shenzhen, China, Huawei is one of the world's largest information and communications technology conglomerates and has become a household name in Latin America and the Caribbean. The company has been met with U.S. sanctions and scrutiny due to the Chinese government's security laws that allow the leveraging of businesses to further state interests and the company's role in creating surveillance technologies used to commit human rights violations within Chinese borders. The view from Latin America, however, is often very different. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Parsifal D'Sola Alvarado, who will be presenting his research findings on these themes. His work is based on interviews with Latin American employees at various regional Huawei offices, alongside conversations with relevant policymakers. It is a great contribution to our understanding of this sector and a valuable perspective from the region. Parsifal is the founder and executive director of the Andrés Bello Foundation China Latin America Research Center based in Bogotá, Colombia. A specialist in Chinese foreign policy and Sino-Latin American relations, he is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and was former acting foreign policy advisor on China to the Foreign Affairs Ministry of the Interim Government of Venezuela. We're also joined today by two discussants. Margaret Myers is a senior advisor to the Latin America program here at USIP. She is also the director of the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue and adjunct researcher with the Núcleo Milenio sobre los Impactos de China and Latin America. Myers joined USIP after 12 years of work on Asian engagement with Latin America and previously also served as an analyst on both regions at the U.S. Department of Defense. Shazeda Ahmed is Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Center on Race and Digital Justice at the University of California, Los Angeles. She holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Information, and her research has included exploration of how tech firms and the Chinese government co-produce the country's social credit system, and also on the political economy and human rights implications of emotion recognition technologies in China. Today's panel will be moderated by Henry Tugendhat, who's an economist on the China team here at USIP. Henry has worked on China's impact on conflict dynamics in Africa and Latin America for over a decade through previous employment at the Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom, the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and the World Bank Group's Macroeconomics, Trade, and Investment team. After the initial panel discussion, we invite you to ask questions via the online chat box, which our panelists will answer in Q&A. Thank you, and now I turn it over to Parsifal to start us off.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. First and foremost, thank you to the United States Institute of Peace for sponsoring this kind of work, which is extremely timely and brings a Latin American perspective into the conversation, which I think is of the utmost important given all the conversation nowadays in Washington, D.C. concerning the use of Chinese technology, not only in the U.S., but also abroad. I'd like to begin with the most obvious conclusion of the paper, which is that the controversy surrounding Huawei in the United States and other Western countries has not been echoed in Latin America and the Caribbean. So to date, not one Latin American country has banned or implemented any sort of restrictions on Huawei or other Chinese telecommunication company. To the contrary, Huawei is actually expanding its presence as one of the main information and communications technology enterprises in the region. And even though most of the work and the research done for this paper was done between 2022 and 2023, still a year afterwards, this remains a fact. Huawei is a very important player, and there is no reason to think that, be it Huawei or any other PRC ICT firm, is going to reduce their participation because of the geopolitics or its competition with the United States. Having said that, well, the paper reaches several conclusions. So I'm going to read them, and I'll try to address them one by one, and in the hopes that we can have a open conversation about the conclusions afterwards with the rest of the panel. So another of the conclusions is that Huawei actively leverages China's foreign policy and diplomatic ties in Latin America and the Caribbean to win clients and gain market share. Throughout the paper, I cite multiple examples of this in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Peru, in Ecuador, where there is a clear, evident cooperation between the diplomatic corps, so China's representations across the region, across these countries, and Huawei's projects and management in the region. There's this kind of symbiosis that takes place. It does vary by country. There are even some cases where embassies, because of the narrative going around Huawei and other Chinese firms in Western countries, primarily the US, they try to keep a distance. So take this with a grain of salt. It does vary across countries, and it's also dependent on the ambassador. In some cases, they actually even shy away from being perceived as aligning with the interests of Chinese firms, in this case, Huawei. So just to cite a couple of examples, probably the most extreme one will be the case of Venezuela, where, and I've talked about this, and I've done a lot of research on China-Venezuela relations. It's one of the cornerstones of the decade of the 2000s of Chinese foreign policy in the region. It was a stepping stone for not only diplomatic efforts, but also for the expansion of PRC economic engagement across the region. So this was an important platform for Huawei. Huawei benefited tremendously from the close relations that developed during the 13-year tenure of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and of all the financing that was provided by the Sino-Venezuelan joint funds. This was a very, very large, over 50 billion financing agreement between China and Venezuela that benefited a lot of Chinese companies, Huawei included, as funding for their projects in Venezuela. At its peak participation around 2010, 2011, Venezuela, primarily Caracas, operations that were coordinated from Huawei offices in Caracas that expanded to the rest of the region. And this is just one case. We saw this. We saw the same kind of interaction in Ecuador, in Bolivia, through a lot of these government-to-government agreements where that benefited the participation of Huawei. So in a sense, and again, take this, it really depends on where we're sitting. If we're in Lima, or if we're in Caracas, or if we are in Buenos Aires, it does vary by country. So while there are some regional trends in the way Huawei operates, there are some variations depending on local institutions, the level of closeness between the Chinese government and the local government. So it's important to not, generalize these kind of practices across all countries. But that being said, there are some trends, and this conclusion I mentioned about cooperation with the Chinese diplomatic corps is definitely one of them. Second point I would like to make is that, clients across the region, generally speaking, particularly service providers, tend to hold a very positive view of Huawei. But on the other hand, local employees seem to prefer working for Huawei competitors. This conclusion was very obvious from all the interviews that were conducted, even though that on the other side, the same side of that coin is that all the people that I interviewed gained in-depth and very valuable experience when working for Huawei. There was a lot of complaints in terms of how strenuous the work was, working into weekends, working overtime without due pay. So it's a mixed analysis when we look at local employees. And when we compare it to the clients of Huawei, you get a sense of why Huawei has that positive reputation amongst its clients. From the local employees' perspective, because of this, the way Huawei is. Let me go back a little bit. Huawei's operational practices are extremely dynamic, and they are well integrated. So their offices across Latin America are pretty much integrated into a platform that connects them to Huawei offices in China, and they work in tandem. There's while some aspects are being attended locally, there is a group of people in China addressing technical issues, and this is all communicated through a unified platform. So this gives Huawei a huge advantage as a service provider. It can, when several of the people I interviewed have also worked for Huawei competitors such as Siemens, Nokia, Samsung, and it was very obvious to me that when they compared their experiences working for Huawei and for these other companies, that Huawei had a better infrastructure and much larger. So even though these are all international ICT firms, Huawei by far has a larger employee base. And since they work basically across the 24-hour time frame, because when problems are presented in Latin America, they are triangulated to offices in China that while people are sleeping here, they're working on the other side of the globe, and vice versa. But again, from the employee perspective, there was a consensus that local workers had they reach. There's a point where they cannot progress as professionals. So field engineers have a very fixed position. They get very well compensated for it, but and this is one of the reasons why, at least all the people that I interviewed, they saw their work at Huawei always through a lens of, this is just going to be a chapter in my life. I'm going to work, I'm going to gain experience, I'm going to get well paid, but this is definitely not somewhere, and not a company where I see myself in the future. And especially given the fact that none of them ever, and this is just to give you a sense of their point of view. Amongst all the interviewees, there's over 40 years of working experience. Some were 4 years for Huawei, other for longer, 6 or 7, and it's quite telling that that none of them actually saw themselves like, this is a company I want to grow with. And when you compare this with the experiences that these same interviewees had in other companies, and especially the Koreans, there was like a very positive view of the way Samsung operates and treats its employees. So there's a stark difference on the work culture in Huawei and the work culture of its competitors, primarily. Well, there's not many competitors, to be honest. So we will have, if the European companies, you have Korean, Japanese, and US-based companies, because it's a highly concentrated industry that benefits big players like Huawei, like Samsung. So if you want to work in the telecom sector, especially in the providers of hardware like Huawei, there aren't many players in town. So I think that's also an important aspect of the research, is that this is a particular industry where it's pretty hard to shift from one company to another. There are NDAs that prohibit you from shifting right away from one company to another. And this is not something specific to Huawei. It's just the way the industry works. So Samsung has them, Nokia has them, Siemens has them. So because we tend to, especially nowadays with how to be honest, how toxic the conversation around Chinese technology has become, we tend to, in my view, make the mistake of singling out PRC companies just because they are from the PRC, when there's a lot of aspects that are endogenous to the industry, regardless of where the company is based. So yes, there are concerns regarding Chinese technology and Huawei in particular, but it's important to have an informed conversation, and that's why this research in particular is very important. So we can differentiate which aspects we can ascribe to a specific company, in this case Huawei, and which aspects are just the way the industry works. And this is another important conclusion, the paper, or more than a conclusion, an aspect that I sought to highlight in the conclusions, is that there is no way for any government, any company, and even as us as individual users of technology, to have 100% certainty that our cell phone or TV or any electronic appliance that requires regular software updates, there is no timely or cost-effective way of securing that hardware, and that applies to any company or to any electronic device. It's like you can pass a phone through the best checks, hardware and software checks, but the moment that cell phone downloads a software update, you have to do it all over again. And as we all know, nowadays the world, especially in the ICT sphere, is a service industry that requires constant um, um, service support from its providers. So for regions like Latin America and the Caribbean, where development, access to networks, access to technology is much more important than the security aspect of networks in this case. This puts the region in frank contrast with the United States, that for a multitude of reasons prioritizes security, especially in its relation with the PRC. And an important caveat here is that a lot of the policies that the United States has been implemented over the past few years, especially beginning during the Trump administration, and that has been, while the rhetoric has been toned down, the policies have even incremented in terms of driving a wedge between the United States technology sector and that of China. When you're sitting in Bogota, this is, and I don't agree with this, but it's the way it's usually perceived. There is a tendency to view the competition between China and the US through a geopolitical lens. What do I mean by this? Is that the system of governance of the United States and of China are not taken into account. They are viewed as two great powers vying for control. So when your view of the world is a geopolitical one, this sees any kind of security agenda by the United States perceived as a way to counter the PRC, and it's not viewed from the local security perspective. So that's an important aspect of the conversation in Latin America. So when the United States comes, knocking with a China agenda that is kind of disguised as a security agenda, it's counterproductive, because, to be honest, and at least this was again pretty obvious in the interviews, these concerns tend to be discarded because they are viewed as, this has nothing to do with us. If you want to have a technology, a competition, war, however you want to call it, with China, that's your problem. That's not ours. We will, make free use of these technologies, and we will just, make use of the most competitive technologies and companies. So at the end of the day, Latin American governments, Latin American companies will be on a different footing when it comes to the use of Chinese technologies. Recommendations. The U.S. and other companies that compete with Chinese ICT firms, Huawei in particular, do have a way to gain larger market share, but the objective, the goal, can never be to push out Huawei or any other Chinese company out of the region. It's just simply not going to happen. You can minimize and you can diversify the number of participants in the market, but to think that such strong competitors like Huawei are going to just simply leave the region because of U.S. pressure, even though the U.S. does have a lot of coercive tools at its disposal, it's just simply disingenuous to think that nowadays, given a more a multipolar world that we're living in, that the U.S. can simply impose this kind of policies. So it's much better to work to address countries' concerns regarding the use of technology without singling out the use of Chinese technology or the participation of Chinese companies like Huawei. I'll leave it up to that. There's obviously a lot more that we can talk about, and I'll leave it to my co-panelists to, well, address other conclusions that I've made in the paper. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Parsifal. Well, if anybody needed any convincing that they should read this report, I think it also bears reminding that, or noting that before Parsifal developed his expertise and love of all things geopolitical and China-related, he was a telecommunications engineer, so he knows what he's talking about, and this is a fantastic contribution to the literature, and thank you so much for doing this, Parsifal. We are also very, very fortunate to be joined by Margaret and Shazeda, who you've already heard a lot about. I think Margaret's going to start from the regional perspective, the China-Latin America relationship, which she's spent a lot of time working on in China, in Latin America and beyond, and then followed by Shazeda, who equally has done just fantastic work on all things China tech, within China, outside China, the future of China's data management and beyond. So I'm going to hand it over to Margaret, then Shazeda, then I'll have a quick question from Parsifal if we've got time, and then we'll do Q&A from there.
Great. Well, thank you, Henry, and congratulations again, Parsifal, on this absolutely fascinating paper. Parsifal has touched on a lot of the main points, but there's much more, I think, to be even derived from the findings. It is a fascinating paper, again, based on wide-ranging analysis that was conducted over many, many months, and even longer, perhaps in certain cases, Parsifal, and this sort of very unique access that Parsifal has, both in terms of technical expertise, but also to those who are working for Huawei and in this sector, the ICT sector broadly writ, right, in various Latin American countries is really quite unique. So we are fortunate to have this analysis and to be able to understand the Latin American perspective much better, much more thoroughly as a result. So many congrats again, and I highly recommend reading it. It is a fascinating read. I'll make just a handful of points in hopes of provoking more in the way of discussion, and certainly Shazeda will have a lot more to say on the technical side than I possibly ever could. But my sense in reading this, my takeaway, sitting here in Washington D.C., but also as somebody who really works extensively in the region and tries very hard to incorporate the Latin American perspective in my own analysis, was, just how much of a challenge Huawei, but also wide-ranging other, telecommunications and ICT companies, pose to those that are currently looking to engage in these sectors, in these industries in the Latin American region. And what the paper does is to demonstrate, why this may be. And some of these reasons are very technical in nature, as Parsifal mentioned, right there. The technologies themselves are seen as high quality, right? They're, in addition, a very big part of the paper, right, is reference to Huawei's customer service, which is seen broadly as something of if not superior, the very, very high quality. And so these perceptions have made for, I think, a growing demand for Huawei equipment and services in parts of the region. But as Parsifal mentioned, right, there are diplomatic channels that have been established over the course of over a decade in certain cases, right, with an eye toward eventually establishing, more in the way of commercial activity in this space, whether as concerns 5G or, really far beyond that in many many cases, right? There is, in general, again, as Parsifal articulated very clearly, a real lack of concern about U.S. information on the security implications of Chinese technologies. This is not something that resonates at all in the region. And fortunately, I believe that, that the U.S. narrative has evolved somewhat to not stress these points so extensively. But nevertheless, I mean, the point that Parsifal has made is absolutely fundamental, absolutely critical. This is not a message that is well received. And then, beyond all of this, there's the pricing component, right? And when you have the providers of these technologies, appealing to their boards and looking to ensure a certain bottom line, obviously they are going to be going for the equipment and services that are going to allow them to have the greatest overall profits and to make their boards of directors happy. And that is just the equation, the calculation that we are all dealing with at this particular juncture. This is not something that is specific to Huawei. It's not something that's specific to 5G. It's not something that's specific to ICT. This is something where U.S. companies, European companies, Japanese companies, even Latin American companies in certain cases are feeling the squeeze sort of across the board. And, you talk to car manufacturers, you talk to others in these spaces that have been, these industries that have been promoted so extensively by China, through its own industrial policy in recent years. And you hear their very deep concerns about being able to compete really in any form with China. I mean, certainly EVs is a big issue, right? Solar panels, a lot of other areas too. So it's a big problem. And then, one of the other things that Parsifal mentioned, which I think deserves some, additional attention, is this first mover advantage issue, right? You establish yourself sometimes because of very low prices, but then you provide the services, you have the NDAs, you have the various other contractual and structural elements that ensure some continuity of service or of provision of equipment over time. And so all of these things, point toward more. Right, more from not necessarily in the ICT realm, or excuse me, in the 5G realm, right? We're kind of moving beyond the 5G question at this juncture, right? Certainly, there are many more countries that are looking to adopt 5G, and they have already worked with Huawei extensively on 3G and 4G. But there's so much more happening. So the trend is toward more. The trend is also toward vertical integration in ICT, right? So we're seeing the equipment, right? Certainly, we're also seeing enterprise products. We're seeing industrial solutions, right? It's something that Huawei itself calls, a vertical integration toolkit, right? We're seeing R&D across the region. We're seeing consulting and professional services, and also, the support services that are described so extensively in the paper. And so, in practice, I mean, just watching this, we watch Chinese FDI very closely, right, in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean. And what you'll see is not only the provision of, for example, handsets, right, Huawei handsets, of various degrees of quality. You'll see $20 handsets for lower income consumers in Central America, for example, and more advanced technologies elsewhere in the region. But then, also, fintech services, the other sort of, advisory and professional services, industrial, products, enterprise products, data centers. But then even beyond that, you have Huawei, for example, engaged in the development of a solar park that is intended to feed with energy, right, these data centers, which are hugely energy intensive, right, to ensure some degree of continuity well into the future. So it's a full integration. And if we're talking about integration, we can go so far as to include also the extractive activity that's all related to this, much of which is happening in the Latin American region if we're talking about lithium and the lithium triangle. So Huawei isn't doing that extraction, but certainly a number of other Chinese companies are, and a lot of this, it's something that is in many ways, if not explicitly, then over, within the context of the industry itself and the supply chains themselves is integrated. And so I think I'll just end by saying, There are, I think, a handful of places where, where the U.S. has begun to think about, competition more extensively, and not just the U.S., but other partner companies and partner nations. Certainly in Costa Rica, there have been some efforts to try to incorporate more U.S. technologies, in part by, ensuring that Intel's investments there are well underway and well established, and are contributive to the local economy, but also to integrate and allow for more in the way of other service providers and equipment providers to be present. So a real diversification of technological equipment and services in that country in particular. But that's one country of many. But I do think this underscores the importance of working, very closely with partners across the board to bring solutions to the Latin American region. There is a lot that the U.S. and Japan have done in the Pacific region, for example, that I think could be in many ways replicated, right, in the Latin American context, and has not happened quite to date. And then finally, it's important to also understand all of this in the broader context, right? Certainly there's been a lot of ICT engagement over time. It's becoming exceedingly complex for the various reasons that Parsifal mentions in his report. Complex and competitive, right? And however, we need to understand that this is part of, of China's ever-evolving but intensifying industrial policy, right? If we see a real promotion at this, whether we're talking about new infrastructure, whether we're talking about new quality productive forces, right? Whether we're talking about any of this terminology that has been used and employed very recently by Chinese officials, party members, by Xi Jinping himself, right? We're talking about a focus on those sectors that China deems critical to its own economic upgrading. And I do not imagine that we will see, this change all that much in the coming years. This is fundamental to China and these industries, whether we're talking ICT or energy transition and solar in particular, battery development, EVs, all of these have been emphasized domestically and globally. And more than anything, the Latin American region and more broadly speaking, the global South, if we want to use that terminology, right, is a critical market for these things. Increasingly, if, in the context of EVs, for example, we see some tariffs being placed on EV entry into the United States and presumably also in the EU in the coming months or years. So this is a trend ongoing, and I imagine we'll see even more in the way of activity in the coming years.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was fantastic. I'm going to hand straight over to Shazeda, and then we'll go from there. But if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to them in the Q&A session. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Henry and Margaret. A lot of my comments are also folded into my questions, so I'm happy to repose my questions later in the Q&A. But I really wanted to emphasize that as I read this report, it confirmed something I think many researchers I've worked with, certainly over, let's say, the last decade, watched slowly happen with kind of limited U.S. intervention beyond a narrative attempt to control the perception of Huawei abroad, right? And it's this strategy that Parsifal lays out very beautifully and clearly in this report, that Huawei kind of both understood and met both local demand and conditions at a period of time when its competitors either did not have the will to, or just, as your report documents, didn't have the resources and the state backing from their own government, the subsidization to achieve. So my comments and my questions kind of fit within three buckets. One is thinking about this as what kinds of strategies and patterns are you seeing across the global South when thinking about interventions? Another is thinking more about that kind of labor violations piece of the report. And then more broadly about the kinds of solutions Parsifal is suggesting by the end of the report. So throughout reading it, I found myself wondering about broad strokes efforts that the U.S. can make that might be beneficial across all of the global South and certainly across all Latin America. In particular, I was thinking as I read about, this has kind of been a slow but concerted growth of Huawei's presence across the region. And perhaps it calls for a slow and concerted set of responses. For instance, in the report, you talk about how, quote, the U.S. push for the securitization of Chinese technology has largely failed to gain traction in Latin America. But I was really interested in thinking about what efforts U.S. civil society organizations have been making at things such as cybersecurity education in the region. What are the benefits of exploring both the threats to individual Huawei customers, right, on the one hand, which is a specific way of kind of framing this for ordinary people who don't even think about Huawei because it's ubiquitous in their lives, versus the kind of narrative you would have to tell about national security threats to Latin American countries where Huawei dominates the market. And I've also been interested in this question of if anyone has made efforts to calculate the costs imposed by these security risks, because as many of us have kind of pointed out, and certainly you do a really eloquent job in the report, when you make this about a kind of U.S. kind of hegemonic concern or threat to U.S. power, you lose interest in Latin America, right? There's both historical and contemporary reasons why that just isn't a strong sell. So I kind of wondered about that sort of like security narrative and what kinds of meat you would need to put on the bones of that. But again, I can come back to my specific questions. So I also really liked the detail about how other companies in the technology stack affect Huawei's operations, right? You talk about the VMware ban of Huawei in accordance with US regulations, or the UK headquartered HR consultancy, Tangent International, which, as you point out, allows vendors to move personnel around without having to worry about visas, taxes, and paying benefits. I know that neither of these particular positionalities of like third-party companies is novel to telecommunications, but it also is a reminder that this isn't such a simple, like, US companies can take an action and then it kind of hampers the rest of a particular industry, especially one that, as you pointed out, really pursued market share and not revenue, right? There's like such a long and deep presence of Huawei in Latin America that even with the VMware example, right, you talk about how there's this recovery. And so that was something kind of important in thinking about how the U.S. responds. On the labor violations piece, reading the report, I felt like there was a tension in it for me between a sense that Huawei both better understands or is better willing to meet conditions on the ground in Latin American countries than their Western competitors have been. And yet there's the structurally unfair labor conditions that Huawei have imposed by, essentially superimposing Chinese work culture and the hierarchy of that work culture in Huawei offices across Latin America. Or, as you say, quote, staff positions for locals are limited by design. And Huawei supervisors, all Chinese nationals, make sure that local hires know the importance of their positions. Later, you say, it seems that there is a level above which local personnel are never promoted within Huawei. Every interviewee stated that all decision-making positions were held by Chinese nationals. This is so interesting, important. This is like a big contribution of this report, is documenting that through interviews. And I wondered about if there are strong labor movements within any of the Latin American countries you studied that could be leveraged to draw out this point, to draw awareness to it, and kind of have Huawei associated with that in the public eye, because it seems like this is something that people in the industry know, but perhaps is not coming into broader conversations about multinational corporations and labor. And then finally, I wanted to look kind of at some of the solutions you were proposing, right? You say the United States and Latin America will remain in different camps because ultimately the decision to trust in a foreign technology manufacturer is a decision made on political, not technical grounds. And this is like an evergreen point, right? This was true, 5 years ago, perhaps will be true 5 years from now, and is one of the constraints that we're working within. So, you say that the U.S. needs to work towards a reduction of China's footprint in the region. And I think this is a really reasonable proposal. And I was wondering who our allies are in this, specifically what institutions, what concrete approach within these countries. I would have loved to have heard, what are some of the institutions that could be kind of made appeals to, or perhaps even audiences for your report within Latin American countries. And, we heard before the call that it's already been translated into Spanish, so I'd be curious to hear about how it's being received. You say that Washington's efforts to put a security frame around the conversation about China, its government, and its companies are bound to fail. And as I said, I also see this as a historical consequence of distrust in U.S. hegemony. So I wanted to know about recommendations you have for averting solutions that boil down to the U.S. saying, just trust us this time. I think the thing I saw as this kind of slow encroachment of Huawei happened is that so many kind of civil society organizations, U.S. kind of development organizations, they still came down to this just trust us this time. And even when you think about, like, when I worked for the U.S. Naval War College in 2013, right? That was the year that, like, the Five Eyes government started talking about Huawei. And at the time, there was no, like, clear smoking gun, right? We had no real public data. It was simply you have to trust people who have, you know, top secret security clearances, that they know what's wrong with Huawei. And I feel like we've never gotten really past that moment of kind of in transparency around what the security risks are, even though we've had so much kind of more narrative develop since then. So I want to ask finally, what alternative strategies do you propose that speak to Latin American countries' specific concerns? Do they need to come specifically from the telco sector, or could they be kind of broader cross-sector efforts, right? Like I mentioned before, cybersecurity education, or kind of upholding labor rights that companies, including Huawei, can no longer commit unfair labor practices with impunity. And so it sort of speaks to this point, finally, that you make in one of the headers in the report about weak institutions, right? Is institution strengthening perhaps the long, slow response that might be necessary here? And that concludes what I wanted to say. I really enjoyed reading this.
Thank you so much. That was great. Parsifal, would you like to respond to Margaret and Shazeda quickly before I turn it over to the audience?
Sure. No. Thank you so much, Shazeda, for your comments, and they are very much on point. I completely agree with your initial remarks that the response has to be, well, I don't see any way how this could be done overnight. It is something that should be addressed from multiple perspectives, incorporating multiple actors, just because of the nature of technology. So that's why I'm always I've been pretty skeptical of the way the U.S. Has approached the issue of Huawei, because it's making it a country or company specific approach. And as you mentioned, there are other actors, civil society organizations, labor unions, amongst many others, that are not being included in the conversation. And the most important thing is you cannot make it about China. You simply can't. You cannot make it about Chinese law. If you're going to talk about cybersecurity, you can even include examples of how the U.S. might use those to their advantage, and how, just making something up here, how Colombia can prevent U.S. security agencies from intervening in their own affairs, because it has to be across the board and cannot be, again, company or country specific. So I think that would be a much more effective way of engaging these very true risks that exist of just hiring a foreign company. And because Latin America, with some exceptions, is an importer of technology. So, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So regulations, it's a huge area that has, at least, and the research that we've done and that I've done independently, I haven't seen much traction. There is an interest and a willingness by a lot of Latin American governments, and regardless of who's in power, be it a right-leaning or left-leaning leader. And I'm going to give you an example of, this is not in the ICT sphere, but I think it's quite telling. Just a few months ago, I had a conversation with a high-ranking a director of a Argentine state-owned company called HEMSE. It's an active participant in the lithium extraction in the country. And they were talking about how their relationship with Chinese companies, private and state-owned, had gone in the country over the last 5-6 years in the lithium sector. And it was quite an interesting approach, because they talked that there was a lot of tension, especially the first few years in those negotiations about about the labor force. There was a strong push by some Chinese companies of bringing a lot of Chinese highly skilled labor, and not incorporating local labor or trainings. And what the way the company got around this was by involving unions and labor unions and local communities, and telling their Chinese counterparts, look, this is not us. This is actually them putting a problem in our negotiations. We have to address those first before we can actually arrive at a deal. So it was an active policy from the local company to incorporate all these other actors into the negotiations. And overall, they had after, let's just say, the first rough few years at the beginning, they thought, by and large, we got everything that we wanted. It's a very limited participation of highly skilled labor. We were able to include training programs. We were able to incorporate local communities into the service industry that feeds the services required by these companies. So it was a very interesting approach, but it was a local approach. So I think those kinds of examples of kind of trainings of positive engagement and the use of policies by local companies that found a way to get a benefit from the Chinese participation while at the same time protecting their own interests. So, there's a lot to be disaggregated here. But incorporating other actors, especially from civil society, into these conversations, strengthening institutions is it has always been an important weak link of a lot of Latin American countries. And but again, there are also very positive examples like we can learn from. Chile is famous for having strong institutions. Colombia is pretty strong for its public tenders and transparency when it comes to public infrastructure. So there are interesting things going on with varying degrees of impact. But I think engaging all these other actors through different ways, it has been a historical strong suit of the United States, and it's those areas the U.S. has a, let's just call it, a better reputation. The United States, it's highly involved in venture capital across the region. It's highly involved in engaging civil society organizations on human rights issues, on labor issues, on environmental issues. So those are ways you can address U.S. concerns and at the same time benefit the countries, but the actors themselves.
Thank you very much for that. Well, I can't believe we're almost coming to time of the event. So instead of asking you one of my own questions, I am going to turn straight over to audience Q&A. And what I propose to do is give you 3 questions from the audience and have you answer them in batch. And hopefully, if there's a little bit of time for one more question or wrap up at the end, we can do that. But if not, we can wrap up on time. So we've got 2 questions that I'm actually going to consider as one because they're very related. They're about market share. And then we've got one about Open RAN and we've got one about cybersecurity. So for the one about market share, the first question asks whether you see Huawei as a spearhead for more Chinese companies having a growing presence, and how this or does this pose a threat to U.S. security in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then the other related question flags that you've mentioned a large market share opportunity in the U.S. in Latin American markets. Where should U.S. telecoms company be focusing their attention? And what do you advise the U.S. to do? So that's about market share. Number two, about Open RAN, they just ask whether Latin American countries adopted America's Open RAN technology. For audience members who may not be familiar with Open RAN, this is effectively a shift in the business model that the US is driving at the moment, because currently many of these telecommunications carrier networks are dominated by what are called original equipment manufacturers. Forgive me for all the technical language, but effectively there is a dominance by companies like Ericsson, Huawei, and Nokia from beginning to end of the technology chain. And the idea of Open RAN is that you can have more players at each step. So developing the software used within a radio transmitter, for example. And this hopes to leverage US strengths, US business strengths in there. But I think it's an interesting question because it also raises the question of whether there are Latin American firms who could benefit from this transition to Open RAN, or whether they view this differently. Lastly, on the cybersecurity, what does the US do to cooperate with the EU to focus the cybersecurity issue and costs? I think this is another interesting one because as I see it, we've effectively got three main big cybersecurity propositions out there today: the US's, China's, and the EU. So curious for your thoughts on the view from Latin America about those.
Okay, should I go by one, or I don't know if Margaret or Shazeda want to give some comments as well? Okay. Well, in terms of market share, and this is connected to the second question of ORAN, open radio access networks. So far, there's a lot of potential in ORAN, precisely because it diversifies the playing field. Just the way the industry works nowadays, as you mentioned, without getting too technical here, once you acquire hardware from an ICT firm, in this case Huawei, that ties you to the company because of all the services that come with that hardware. They require constant updates in terms of software, and so if you work with one ICT firm, that's a long-term commitment. ORAN is a disruptor because it starts taking away that power that these large companies have, and incorporates other actors, primarily in the software industry. So while there is a lot of potential here, it's still in its infancy. And to be honest, it's really hard to tell where the technology is going to go. So 3 years ago, we weren't, no one had in their minds AI software like ChatGPT and others. Nowadays, we're in a completely different world. So how especially within the 5G industry and 6G and the following generations of this technology, these are going to be very much software driven, not so much a hardware industry, especially if initiatives like Open RAN take off. And there, the obvious quote unquote losers would be the ICT firms. So it's no surprise that companies, including Huawei, but also Ericsson, have been sort of pushing back against the implementation of these kinds of networks. But again, with ORAN, it's interesting because if you see at the group of companies that comprise the ORAN group, you have China's main three operators. You have China Telecom, China Unicom, and China Mobile. So they are members of the ORAN because it will benefit telecom providers. In what way? Telecom providers if they could have a way of not depending on a single company, they definitely will take that chance. So addressing it through the telecom providers is a way to actually change the conversation and address all these concerns that the U.S. has of a primarily Chinese-dominated ecosystem. But again, look, I'm no expert here, but
I fear we've lost Parsifal. Well, Shazeda, would you like to tackle the cybersecurity question?
It's not something I've worked on in a really long time.
Okay.
Sorry. You still hear me?
You're back, yeah. We lost you at the point where, oh dear. This is also very unfortunate because we're now at time for this event. So I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to call it here. So why don't we have Margaret and Shazeda, are there any final remarks that you would like to share or reflections based on Parsifal's questions?
No, I mean, this is true. I do know that, Japanese companies have really great maps on a lot of their websites, sort of documenting the implementation of O-RAN across the region. And it's in many countries, but as Parsifal has noted, it's, still being, implemented in a very, very limited form to date. So we'll see how that evolves, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Parsifal, you're back. I'm afraid we're also at time.
Yeah, sorry.
So we're going to have to say goodbye. But is there one last point that you wanted to make before we say goodbye to everyone?
Well, I don't know where you lost me, but just look, it's very hard to predict how the technology and the ICT world will evolve in the coming years. So my key recommendation to Huawei competitors and to policymakers in the U.S. It's important to, one, bring other actors into the conversation, and two, to change the subject. Even you can address security concerns through other means. And there has to be a lot of ingenuity and banking on U.S. strong suits in other areas to address those concerns that are in line with Latin American interests. And that's, I think, the best way to address U.S. concerns regarding Chinese technology.
Fabulous. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that incredibly rich discussion. Parsifal, Margaret, Shazeda, really, really great job today. Thank you for all of your insights on this very rich topic. Again, highly recommend Parsifal's report to anyone who hasn't read it yet. It's also available in Spanish now. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And I hope you will keep in touch with us. We have 3 more report launches in the coming months about China-Latin America engagements. And we will be sending out more information on those as and when they are established. But once again, thank you so much to all of our panelists today.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.